Hello, welcome to the...
This is Murphy. Woof, woof, growl.
I told you not to say anything.
Like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun. To dream, believe.
Let's listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I am here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And, you know, I listen to my people out there, a couple of my commenters, Susan in particular. She has never left anything but the nicest, most complimentary posts. And she asked me to stop calling people idiots and morons, and I agree. And I'm going to do the best that I can going forward, not to do that because that's not right. And thank you for pointing it out. I'll tell you one of the reasons why I do it is because I do have to watch. I watch pretty much anything that says Idaho 4 Bryan Kohberger now, and as I listen to this stuff. Oh, it's so frustrating. All of the misinformation that's out there, and it's by people that should know better. I have to listen to how on mainstream media they did a special here just came out the other day talking about how he sent excessive messages to one of the victims, and he followed 3 of them on Instagram. I'm like, come on, man. When Ann Taylor says in court there's no connection digitally, and then the prosecutor gets up and says, well, there isn't none. She even said Instagram, said there's none. Didn't argue. That means there isn't any. But I have to listen to this. And goodness, I was watching one. I can't watch all of them. I watch just enough to really get mad. That's why when I get on here, I go to calling people morons. But man, I'll tell you what, Howard Bloom wasn't even guilter enough for some of these people. I watched one where they got on there and they were guilters, and boy, they started hammering Howard Bloom because he wasn't guilter enough on Megan Kelly. I'm like, good grief, how much guilter do you need? But I listened to all this and I go, God, the amount of, misinformation, I hate that word, misinformation, the amount of BS that's out there is ridiculous. And then I see headways start to be made. If you look in the comment section, like on those Megan Kelly videos with Howard Bloom, you look in the comment section, 90% of those comments were hammering the fact that, this is ridiculous and what y'all were saying was ridiculous and you need to look into the evidence. That tells me that the tides are starting to turn. So at this point moving forward, we need some strong voices that are really familiar with the facts of the case to be speaking out on this. And I don't mean... Here's what's not acceptable in my point of view at this point. All right. If you're especially a major content creator and you are trying to point out inconsistencies and make a difference in the case, it's time for you to dive in and know all the details of the case and express your opinion. All this, let me take an email from my man, Bob here, and we'll go through and now, that Bob stuff is gone. You need to know. It needs to be your opinion if you're going to speak on it and have any impact. When y'all see people trying to piggyback off of one of their moderators or commenters going forward, hold them accountable. They need to know this information. It needs to come from the horse's mouth. They don't need to blame anything on some unnamed person. That's ridiculous at this point in the game because we're actually starting to make headway in this case, and we got a kid's life on the line. It's absolutely unreal. And anybody that has followed the facts of this case now, and they know all the BS that has been made up in this case to try to convict Bryan Kohberger, they know, you know it in your heart. They wouldn't make up all of that crap, spread it out on the media, and continue to try to hammer it if there wasn't something wrong here. So the fact that they need to make up lies and BS to try to convict somebody, that that's not right. You talk about beyond a reasonable doubt, that is nowhere near beyond a reasonable doubt. That is beyond a reasonable line of thinking. So we need to start holding everybody accountable on this case. I mean, if you're listening to somebody and they are not familiar with the facts, but they're speaking on behalf of, the people that are righteous in this thing, they need to speak from their heart, not from some unnamed email they got from their friend Bob. All right? That's just my humble opinion in this. Okay, so that's all the ranting I'm going to do, and I'm going to try not to call people idiots and morons going forward. Now, that Get a Clue guy, I mean, I can't help it if I do him, because that dude is a terrible human being. And besides, I went through all of the time and effort that it took to hunt him down, capturing and cage him. So I can say whatever I want about that guy, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. Hush up there now. But in this video, we're going to cover 3 things. Okay, 3 things that are very important. 2 of them are subjective. One of them is going to be very theoretical. One of them is going to be subjective, and one of them is going to be cold, hard facts that people out there need to understand. Because even the people speaking on behalf of our side, they still are they're messing up the information. When things are learned in court, maybe they didn't hear it, all right? So that's why I'm going through this. I'm going to give them the chance to think maybe they just didn't hear it. But when it comes, the 3 things we're going to discuss. Number 1 is those 12 trips prior to Moscow and that tower that represented that Kohberger was using the same tower that serviced the King Road residents. So he could have been anywhere in a 10-mile radius. That is not the case. And if you watched that hearing and you kept your ears and eyes open, you would know that's not the case. So I'm going to discuss that first, because not only did the law enforcement lie about his location, it wasn't just he could have been anywhere in a 10-mile radius, because that tower serviced his house. If you watch that hearing, they knew every place that he was in that town. That's where the drive testing and the call detail reports came in to prove it. And they went over this in court. It wasn't the fact that he was using tower services, so he could have been at the house. He was never near the house, and they knew every spot that he was. And I'll prove that to you in this video. That's one. Second thing, when we are dissecting the crime scene, there's a thing that most people have used to suggest victim assignment. What am I trying to say here? There's a thing that people have used to suggest the targets. The targets. And one of the things they've used to suggest the targets is the fact that, for example, Kaylee experienced way more ferocity in the attack than Maddie. And it's led people to believe that, well, that means that the assailant had more animosity towards Kaylee. I'm going to go through that line of thinking with you in this and show you where that does not insinuate that at all. It insinuates something totally different. And then the last part is the thing that I have the most challenge with, and that is whether or not Kaylee was actually a target. And the reason that I say that is I have gone through incredible amounts to uncover the motive for Kaylee being a target in this case. And while I have come up with many reasons why that could be the case, I have not found anything definitive. So for me to continue to try to suggest that, it makes me no better than people out there trying to suggest that, the frat boys did it because there was an argument at the frat house that nobody can prove. All right, that's not evidence somebody went and unalived somebody. That if they could even prove it, that would be evidence of an argument at the frat house. So if that's as far as you can go and you can't go any further, then you got to stop. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop because I can't go any further on that. And believe me, I have tried, and y'all know I have. So If that's not the case, I have to look at it like this. If that's not the case, then that key point about DM actually traveling to see Kaylee to get her to come back to the house, could there be another explanation that is equally as plausible for that matches up with the evidence? And yeah, I think there can be, and it's not one that we really want to think about, but it's a very big possibility. And based on the other evidence in the case, yeah, I mean it's more likely. So we're going to get into those three things. First thing we're going to cover, though, is where was Bryan Kohberger during those 12 trips to Moscow? Was he anywhere near the house, and can they prove that? No, he was not, and yes, they can. Let's go.
Here, what's added to that set of affidavits is the paragraph that talks about Mr. Kohberger's phone using a tower that provides service to 1122 King on a number of occasions. The PC affidavit says 12. Your Honor needs to take a look at, I believe it is D1B and C. That's an email from Nicholas Balance, and he's talking to the detective in Moscow about the dates that he says this thing happens. And then he puts those dates in his cast draft report and in his cast final report, and they don't match up. There are different dates on those, different times on those. But the really big deal about that is that it's misleading when you say the cell tower that also services this particular location. Moscow has, I think, 2 cell towers that service the town. Those cover places that one shops, places that one eats, places that one gets gas in Moscow. From the records, you can see handoffs, and so you know where a vehicle is going. You can know whether it's stationary or not. You can know whether it's parked, looking at a particular place or not. Based on those records, we also provided the records just so the court would know there's a volume of records. I don't expect the court to decipher those records. But based on those records, they absolutely knew that Mr. Kohberger wasn't around that residence, wasn't parked near the residence, didn't stop and have his phone in a stationary position at that residence. They absolutely knew that that's not what was happening, but they put it in there to make a connection that didn't exist. They put it in there so that the judge would think that this was the right person, and they shouldn't have done that. They knew that was incorrect. They also changed that quite a bit, performed a drive testing, and so there were other bits of data that kept coming in so that they would know that was untrue. Now, for a magistrate to be relying, remember, on somebody who's a witness, somebody who's been interviewed 4 or 5 times, and continually says something that's absolutely impossible, has memory problems, and the judge never knows that, and we'll keep the IGG identification off to the side, but then you have this false narrative that looks like stalking, that looks like following, and it's not true. That is extremely damaging. It's very misleading. It's an outright lie to the magistrate. When you omit that kind of information, when you take that context out, you might as well say stalking, because that's what you're trying to say, and you know that's not true. This court can rely on our proffer in D1B and in the cast draft report and in the cast final report, because those dates change. The court can rely on the evidence that will be produced at a hearing from defense experts that will talk about the handoffs, the patterns of handoffs, and how misleading that paragraph was to the magistrate. The real story is exculpatory to Mr. Kohberger. He was not stationary around that house. He was never at that house. He did go to Moscow. He did drive around, but he wasn't over there. And the phone records absolutely show that. It's misleading when you say the cell tower that also services this particular location. The records, you can see handoffs, and so you know where a vehicle is going. You can know whether it's stationary or not. You can know whether it's parked, looking at a particular place or not. They absolutely knew that Mr. Kohberger wasn't around that residence, wasn't parked near the residence, didn't stop and have his phone in a stationary position at that residence. They absolutely knew that that's not what was happening. BIT performed a drive testing, and so there were other bits of data that kept coming in so that they would know that was untrue. The real story is exculpatory to Mr. Kohberger. He was not stationary around that house. He was never at that house.
Now I got to hold myself accountable too, because my theory for a long time was the last pass in that neighborhood of that Elantra was Kohberger. And they were just pulling up near the King Road house to pick up some illicit substances, because I never could get a definitive statement from Ann Taylor that he was not near the residence ever. People argued with me, I argued back. Well, you know what? I can absolutely, when I hear evidence, like she just said, he was never at the house, that's definitive. All right. So I was wrong on that aspect. So I have to rethink that. I have to rethink that a lot, because when you hear evidence come out in court, and I don't care what anybody says, when Ann Taylor makes a statement and then the prosecution gets up and they do not refute Ann Taylor's statement, then you can bet that statement was true, or else the prosecution would get up and say, well, that ain't true. They never did. So what she was saying was true. So whenever I hear stuff like that, I will absolutely go back, rethink it, because now I've got more details. So everybody else needs to do the same thing. So when you hear people say, well, that the tower, could have been, he could have been anywhere in that 10 miles. No, he couldn't have. They know from the handoffs, from the towers, from the call detail reports, and from the drive test data exactly where Kohberger was during those 12 trips. And he was never near the house. That was a lie. Moving on to point number 2. Okay. Point number 2. We're going to go to victimology for a minute. All right. And I'm going to show you something that has led everybody to believe that possibly Kaylee was one of the targets. Okay. And it's because of the ferocity of the wounds on Kaylee. And they weren't near as ferocious as the wounds on Maddie. So that's made people think, well, then, they had more animosity towards Kaylee than they did Maddie. And then it's possibly the same scenario downstairs. People have suggested that the wounds on Ethan was much more severe than the wounds on Xana. But some people have suggested the wounds on Xana was more severe than the wounds on Ethan. But the one upstairs, the Maddie one, the Kaylee one, that's the one that's really in contention. But I contend that if the wounds are more severe on either Ethan or Xana, it would mean the exact same thing. Okay, so try to put yourself in the mindset as best you can. I know it's impossible, really, but put yourself in the mindset of a perpetrator. And let's suggest for a moment, like they suggest, that this perpetrator was by himself. Now, if he goes into a room that's very small and there's 2 people in a bed side by side, and he has the propensity to commit an unaliving with a knife, think for a minute. As he starts to commit an atrocity, I'm sure his adrenaline rush would be through the roof. He would be in a frenzy. Unless he has done it many times and is very cold and calculated, he would be in a frenzy. And as he began to commit the act on one, there would be no way to restrain himself on the one that he wasn't holding as much animosity towards. All right, so he's not going to start out unaliving Maddie because he doesn't have as much animosity towards her and do it in a cleaner manner. And then once he's done, go to Kaylee, who he has a lot of animosity towards, and then increase his, ferocity. Okay. That's just not going to happen if you really think about it. In a situation like that, I mean, that's a situation where the person would be even in a rage. If you're in a rage, you can't dial back your rage on one person and then dial it up on another. It's impossible in a scenario like that because of the scenario. Now, what is much more probable if you have two victims and their wounds are significantly different? One is more ferocious than the other. Does that suggest any way that one person was more ferocious to the other one? What it actually suggests is one of the perpetrators was more of a ferocious individual than the other. Now, if you have two victims in a room and they have completely different wounds as it relates to ferocity, that would more, I believe, to the point, lead you to believe that you had two separate perpetrators with two separate levels of ferocity. One much more calm, getting the job done. The other one much less calm and much more ferocious. That would be the only way you would have two side-by-side victims with completely different wound patterns. Really let that sink in for a minute. Then as you go downstairs, if again the wound patterns don't match, which we know they don't, that doesn't suggest one perpetrator committing two unalivings in completely different manners because he's more ferociously thinking about one than the other. No, it's two different perpetrators with two different methods and two different temperaments. I think that makes much more sense. And it also lends to the idea of there's more than one perpetrator, which we all know there is. And if the two victims downstairs don't have wounds that match up to Kaylee upstairs and that type of ferocity, well, then that tells us that the two perpetrators downstairs are different perpetrators. At least one of them is a different perpetrator than the one upstairs. That again leads me to believe that this was a 3-perpetrator crime. Really let that sink in. Let me hear your thoughts on that. Now I'm going to go to the last point. Now it has been, my efforts. There are some very strange things, and I've gone through great lengths to make a connection with the motive on Miss Kaylee. I've gone to their family, their possible connections to the underworld, financial things, but I've never been able to make a direct connection. No matter how much I've tried, it's all around there. There's a lot of perception around there, but I've never been able to make a direct connection. So since I'm not able to make a direct connection, I'm not going to bring it up anymore. So that goes back to how she was even there. We all know now that D.M. actually went to get Kaylee, talk her into coming back that weekend. That led us to believe that the perpetrators wanted her back there for a reason. But is there another possible reason? You see, when I look at this crime, I know who's responsible for this crime. And I know who's responsible for the setup of this crime. And it's not some inexperienced frat boys. These are seasoned criminals that have spent many years in the penitentiary. Now, we know the direct connection between D.M. and this group of individuals, and it was through her boyfriend. His dad's a member, so it's not too hard to figure out. Now, the fact that her boyfriend posted a post showing him in Boise, Idaho at 3 a.m. shows me that he knew what was going to take place and he wanted to prove that he was nowhere around. That doesn't mean that he didn't have a direct connection to the person in the house to allow a couple of things to happen. And I don't know that the person in the house, Miss D.M., even knew the you know, the whole scope of what was going to happen. She probably just knew that some things were going to happen and to who they were going to happen to. And she probably had some directives like stay out of the way. You need to wait 8 hours before anybody dials 911 to give us time to get all those guys out of there and out of the state. She probably had some directives like that. And she was able to save her other friend downstairs because of that, because smart criminals know that if they put her in there by themselves, well, then she becomes a prime suspect. But if they leave two of them, well, then she becomes less likely as a suspect. I believe that's why Bethany's still alive. But with all that in mind, the fact that she went and brought Kaylee back, does that mean that Kaylee was a target? Or if she knew what was going to take place beforehand on Maddie and Xana, the targets, but if she had let's say a real disliking of Kaylee, and she went and brought Kaylee back, could that mean that she brought her back because she wanted something to happen to Kaylee, not necessarily the perps? Just a thought. Look, I'm about to watch this Super Bowl here in a minute. I'm about to cook up some grub for it. Me and the wife are going to have a good time watching this thing, going for the Chiefs. I'm not really a Chiefs fan, but I'm going for the Chiefs. I should be a Chiefs fan because of, where they're at, but I used to live in Kansas City for a while. But everybody, I hope has a wonderful day. Until tomorrow, I'm just going to go ahead and let y'all go. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. And until next time, Pavarotti is out.